I was standing in my kitchen, still in my funeral dress, when my mother-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "If you had just let him stay home that weekend, my son would still be alive." Nobody in that room said a word. My daughter was upstairs crying into a pillow that still smelled like her father's cologne, and I had a folded flag sitting on my dining room table that I hadn't even found the strength to look at yet. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could say something like that to me on the same day we buried him. But I didn't. I just stood there, holding a casserole dish some neighbor had dropped off, and I let her words sink into me like a stone dropping into deep water. My name is Sarah, and my husband was Staff Sergeant Michael Doyle, United States Marine Corps. We'd been married 11 years. He was the kind of man who whistled while he made pancakes on Saturday mornings, who called our daughter Peanut even when she turned 12 and told him she was too old for it, who kept a photo of his platoon taped inside his locker at every duty station we ever lived at. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near danger that week. He was 3 weeks from finishing a training rotation, and then he was supposed to come home for good, at least for a while. That's what made everything so much harder to understand. There was no deployment, no firefight overseas, just a training accident on a base in North Carolina that the Marine Corps called under review, which is a phrase I would come to hate more than almost any other in the English language. His mother, Linda, had never liked me much. Not really. She thought I'd taken her son away from her the day I married him, moved him 3 states from where he grew up, filled his head with ideas about building a life somewhere other than the small town he was raised in. She never said any of that outright before he died. She saved it for after, when grief needed somewhere to go and I was the easiest target in the room. I understood grief does strange things to people. I told myself that every night for weeks. But understanding something doesn't always make it hurt less. The knock on my door had come on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember it was raining, one of those cold gray rains that makes everything feel heavier than it already is. I opened the door and there were 2 Marines standing on my porch in their dress blues, and I knew before either one of them said a single word. You always hear people say they knew immediately, and I used to think that was just something people said afterward to make the story sound more dramatic. But it's true. There's something about 2 Marines standing on your porch that early in the morning that tells you everything before they open their mouths. The older one was a captain, and I remember his name was Captain Reyes. He had kind eyes, tired eyes, the kind of eyes that told me he'd done this before and hated every single time. He asked if he could come inside, and I nodded because I couldn't find my voice, and I sat down on my own living room couch like a stranger in my own house while he told me that my husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Doyle, had died as a result of injuries sustained during a training exercise. He said the word training very carefully, like it was supposed to make things easier, like it meant something different than losing him overseas would have. It didn't. Dead is dead. I remember thinking that thought so clearly, so coldly, that it scared me. My daughter Emma was at school when it happened. I had to go pick her up early, and I remember standing in the school office trying to figure out how you tell a 12-year-old girl that her father isn't coming home. Not that day, not any day. She looked at my face before I said a single word, and she just started crying. Because kids know. They always know before you tell them. That's one of the cruelest things about grief, how it announces itself on your face before you've even found the words. The days after that are mostly a blur to me now, pieces of memory floating in no particular order. I remember Linda arriving from Ohio 2 days later, her face pale and hard, refusing to hug me at the airport. I remember the casualty assistance officer, a young lieutenant named Ford, sitting at my kitchen table explaining benefits and paperwork in a voice that stayed calm, no matter how many times I had to ask him to repeat something, because I couldn't process words that day. I remember the funeral home, picking out a casket like I was picking out furniture, my hands shaking so badly I could barely sign my name. But what I remember most clearly, what I will never forget as long as I live, is the day of the funeral itself. It was a full military honors funeral. Michael had earned that. 8 years of service, 2 deployments, a Purple Heart from his first tour that he never liked to talk about, and a reputation among his fellow Marines as someone who would do anything for the men under him. The honor guard stood at attention in their dress blues, 7 rifles raised for the 21-gun salute, and when the bugler played taps, I felt something break inside my chest that I don't think has ever fully healed. They folded the flag with such precision, 13 careful folds, and the commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Whitfield, knelt down in front of me and presented it. He said the words every military widow has heard, about a grateful nation, about faithful and dedicated service. And I took that flag into my arms like it was the last piece of my husband I would ever be allowed to hold. That's when Linda made her first comment. Not the one in the kitchen later, but a quieter one, muttered just loud enough for me to hear as the colonel walked away. "That flag should be mine," she said. "I'm his mother." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just held on tighter. It was later that day, back at my house, surrounded by casseroles and sympathy cards and neighbors who didn't know what to say, so they just stood around looking uncomfortable, that Linda said the thing about me being responsible for his death. I found out afterward that she'd said similar things to a few other family members at the reception. Quieter versions. Things like, Sarah never should have let him take that assignment, and, if she'd pushed him to get out after his last deployment like I told her to, none of this would have happened. I didn't know the full extent of what she'd been saying until my sister-in-law, Michael's younger sister Katie, pulled me aside near the coat closet and told me, her voice shaking, "Sarah, you need to know what Mom's telling people." Katie was the one person on that side of the family who had always been kind to me, always defended me when Linda got difficult over the years. She told me that Linda believed, truly believed, that Michael had requested that particular training rotation because things were strained at home, that he was trying to get away from some kind of marital problem. That wasn't true. Things weren't strained. If anything, that year had been one of the best years of our marriage, the two of us finally settling into a rhythm after his last deployment, finally letting ourselves breathe again as a family. I asked Katie where her mother had gotten an idea like that, and she said she didn't know, only that Linda had been saying it to anyone who would listen, framing it almost like I'd sent him away, like his death was some kind of consequence I was responsible for. I felt sick standing there in my own hallway, in my own home, listening to Katie describe a story about my marriage that wasn't true, that painted me as the reason my husband was gone. I didn't confront Linda that day. I didn't have it in me. I had a daughter upstairs who needed me, and a house full of grieving people, and I told myself I would deal with it later, when things settled down, when the fog of the funeral lifted and I could think straight again. But grief doesn't work on that kind of schedule. The days turned into weeks, and Linda's version of events didn't fade. It grew. She started calling relatives I barely knew, repeating her theory, adding details that weren't true, saying that she'd heard from someone in Michael's unit that he'd been distracted, that he'd been asking to be sent somewhere else, anywhere else, in the weeks before he died. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to call every single person she'd spoken to and set the record straight. But another part of me, the exhausted part, the part still learning how to get out of bed every morning, just wanted to disappear from it all. I had Emma to think about. I had a house to keep running. I had a folded flag sitting in a display case I hadn't even had time to put up yet, and a box of Michael's personal effects that the Marine Corps had shipped back to me, that I still hadn't found the courage to open. That box sat in my closet for almost a month before I opened it. Lieutenant Ford had told me it would contain his personal items, whatever had been in his locker and his gear at the time of the accident. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor one night after Emma had gone to sleep, staring at that box like it might tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. Eventually, I opened it. Inside there was his wallet, his wedding ring on a chain because he never wore it during training exercises, a couple of challenge coins from different commanding officers over the years, a small notebook he used to jot down things, and an envelope. The envelope had my name on it, in his handwriting, Sarah. Just that. Nothing else on the outside. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't open it. I sat there for probably 10 minutes just holding it before I finally worked up the nerve. Inside was a letter, several pages long, dated about 2 weeks before he died. It wasn't a goodbye letter, not exactly. Marines write letters like that sometimes. One's meant to be opened only if something happens to them. But this wasn't quite that either. It read more like something he'd written for himself, working through his thoughts, maybe intending to show me eventually, or maybe never intending anyone to see it at all. In it, he wrote about how much he loved this last stretch of training, how it felt like the perfect bridge between the career he'd built and the quieter life we'd talked about starting once his contract was up. He wrote about a conversation with his commanding officer, a man named Colonel Whitfield, the same one who had presented me the flag, about accelerating his timeline for a transfer to a training billet closer to home. Something that would have kept him stateside permanently, something that would have meant no more deployments, ever. He wrote about surprising me and Emma with the news once it was finalized. He wrote, in his own plain, unpolished way, about how much he loved coming home to us, how our house had started to feel like the safest place in the world to him after years of moving around, how he wasn't running from anything, he was running towards something. I read that letter maybe a dozen times that first night. It didn't erase the accusation Linda had made, but it gave me something solid to hold on to, proof in his own words that nothing about our marriage had pushed him away, that if anything, he'd been moving toward more time with us, not less. I didn't show that letter to Linda right away. Part of me wanted to throw it in her face and say, read this, and then tell me again that I'm responsible. But another part of me, the part that still remembered she was grieving her only son, held back. I told myself I would find the right moment. That moment came sooner than I expected, and not in the way I planned. About 6 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield's office. He wanted to meet with me in person, along with a representative from the investigation into the training accident. My stomach dropped the moment I heard that. In my mind, investigation had always meant something bureaucratic, something distant, paperwork that would eventually confirm what I already knew, that it had been a terrible accident. I didn't expect what came next. I asked if I could bring someone with me for support, and the aide on the phone said that was fine. Family members were welcome to attend. I called Katie. She came with me, and much to my surprise, so did Linda. I think Katie told her about the meeting, and Linda insisted on being there, still convinced in her own mind that this meeting would somehow validate the story she'd been telling everyone. We met in a small conference room on base, the kind with a long table and too many chairs, and a flag standing in the corner. Colonel Whitfield was there, along with a major I didn't recognize named Hensley, who introduced himself as part of the investigative team. There was a folder on the table in front of them, thick with papers. Colonel Whitfield spoke first. He told me how much Michael had meant to his unit, how he'd personally requested this meeting because he wanted me to hear the findings directly from him rather than through a letter. He said that the investigation had concluded and that it revealed something that hadn't been made public in the initial notification. My heart was pounding. Linda sat across from me, arms crossed, and I could tell she thought whatever was coming would confirm her suspicions, that somehow this would be about Michael being distracted, unfocused, wanting to be somewhere else. Major Hensley opened the folder and explained that the accident had occurred during a live exercise involving a piece of equipment that had failed due to a maintenance oversight, not due to any error on Michael's part. In fact, records showed that Michael had flagged a concern about that same piece of equipment 3 days earlier, in writing, to his immediate supervisor, a gunnery sergeant named Coates. That report had not been acted on in time. The room went very quiet. Linda's arms slowly uncrossed. I watched her face change, watched the color drain out of it as she realized what this meant. It meant her son hadn't been careless. It meant he hadn't been distracted by problems at home, hadn't been running from anything, hadn't made some kind of fatal mistake born out of a troubled marriage. He had done exactly what a good Marine does. He had noticed a problem and reported it through the proper channels, and the system had failed him, not the other way around. Colonel Whitfield said something then that I will never forget. He said that, in his career, he had read more incident reports than he could count, but Michael's written concern, found in the maintenance log, stuck with him because of how specific and how professional it was. He said Michael had written, "Recommend immediate inspection before further use, potential safety risk to personnel." He said those words slowly, letting them sit in the room. Linda made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and put her hand over her mouth. I didn't say anything at first either. Part of me felt a strange, cold vindication, and another part of me just felt the grief all over again. Fresh, because this new information didn't bring him back, it just told me how he died with more clarity than before. But I also felt something else building in me, something that had been sitting quiet since the day of the funeral. I looked at Linda, and for the first time since Michael died, I found my voice. I told her, right there in that conference room, in front of Colonel Whitfield and Major Hensley, that I had something she needed to see. I told her about the letter. I told her what was in it, about his plans to transfer stateside permanently, about his own words describing our home as the safest place he'd ever known. I told her that, whatever she believed about our marriage being strained, whatever she'd been telling relatives for the last month and a half, it wasn't true, And now I had two separate pieces of proof: his own letter and an official Marine Corps investigation, both saying the same thing. He wasn't running from anything. He was doing his job, the way he always did, and a piece of broken equipment took him from us. Linda didn't respond right away. She just sat there, staring at the folder on the table, and then she started crying, in a way I hadn't seen her cry, not even at the funeral. It wasn't performative grief. It was something raw and stripped down, the sound of someone realizing they'd been wrong about something enormous, while also mourning a son they'd never get back regardless. Colonel Whitfield gave us a moment. He stepped out of the room with Major Hensley, and it was just me, Linda, and Katie left at that table. Katie reached over and put her hand on her mother's shoulder, and Linda finally looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. She said my name, quietly, like she wasn't sure she had the right to say it. "Sarah," she said, "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give." I didn't rush to forgive her right then. I want to be honest about that. Too much had been said over the past 6 weeks. Too many relatives had heard her version of events. Too many nights I'd lain awake wondering if there was some truth buried in what she'd been saying. Some failure on my part I hadn't recognized. I told her that. I told her the apology would mean more to me if it came with her calling every single person she'd spoken to and correcting what she'd told them, the same way she'd spread the story in the first place. She agreed immediately, without hesitation, which surprised me. She said she would call everyone, every aunt, every cousin, every family friend who had heard her theory, and tell them the truth, that Michael died doing his job well, flagging a danger that wasn't fixed in time, not running away from a marriage that was never in trouble to begin with. Over the following weeks, she did exactly that. Katie told me later that some of those calls were difficult to listen to, that Linda cried through most of them, admitting she'd let her grief turn into blame, and that blame had landed on the wrong person. I wasn't there for those calls, and I didn't need to be. What mattered to me was that the story stopped spreading, that Emma wouldn't grow up hearing some warped version of her parents' marriage from relatives who'd only ever heard Linda's account. The relationship between Linda and me didn't heal overnight. Grief and old resentment don't disappear just because new facts come to light. But something shifted after that meeting. She started calling me more, not to check up in a suspicious way like she used to, but just to talk, to ask about Emma, to ask about how I was holding up. A few months later, she asked if she could see the letter herself, the actual pages, not just what I'd described to her that day in the conference room. I hesitated before agreeing. That letter had become the most private thing I owned, proof of my husband's love that felt too personal to hand over to anyone, even his own mother. But I thought about what it might mean to her, a mother who had spent weeks torturing herself with the wrong story about her son's final days, and I decided she deserved to read his own words for herself. I drove to her hotel the next time she came into town, and I sat with her while she read it. I watched her face as she got to the part about his plans to transfer stateside, about wanting to surprise Emma and me, about how safe our home had made him feel after years of moving from base to base. She read it twice through, slowly, and when she finished, she folded the pages carefully and held them against her chest for a long moment before handing them back to me. She told me that Michael used to write her letters too, when he was younger, back before he'd married me, before duty stations and deployments had filled up so much of his time. She said, reading his handwriting again, even in a letter meant for me, brought back a version of her son from before all the years and distance between them, back when he still lived down the hall from her, back when he was just her boy, and not yet a Marine, not yet a husband, not yet a father. That was the first time I saw Linda cry in a way that felt like healing, instead of anger. We sat together in that hotel room for almost 2 hours, telling each other stories about him, the little things, the way he always burned the first pancake and threw it away without telling anyone, the way he used to call his mother every single Sunday no matter what time zone he was in, the way he'd calmed down so much after Emma was born, how fatherhood had softened something in him that deployments had hardened. It's been a little over a year now since that meeting in the conference room. Linda comes to visit every couple of months, and she and Emma have gotten closer than they ever were before, closer even than when Michael was alive, in a strange way. Emma keeps a copy of that letter, a photocopy I made for her once she was old enough to understand it fully, tucked into a box with some of her father's old photographs. I still have the original, along with his flag, displayed together in a case in our living room. the same flag Linda once said should have been hers. She never brought that up again after that day in the conference room. I think she understood, somewhere underneath the grief and the misplaced blame, that the flag belonged where Michael would have wanted it, in the home he was fighting to get back to, with the wife and daughter he wrote about wanting more time with, not less. Gunnery Sergeant Coates, the supervisor who hadn't acted on Michael's report in time, was reassigned following the investigation. I don't know all the details of what happened to him professionally, and honestly, after everything, I found I didn't have much room left in me for anger toward him specifically. The system failed, more than any one person failed. I've made peace with that as much as a person can make peace with something like this. Colonel Whitfield still sends a card every year around the anniversary of Michael's death. Last year, he included a photograph I'd never seen before. Michael standing with his unit during a training exercise a few months before the accident, laughing at something out of frame, dog tags catching the light. I keep that photograph on my nightstand now, next to the one from our wedding day. Emma is 13 now. She still calls me Peanut sometimes, as a joke, because she says it's the only way she can hear her father's voice through me. She wants to study engineering when she's older, something about wanting to design equipment that never fails the way that one did, though I don't think she's fully articulated that reasoning even to herself yet. I see so much of Michael in her, the same quiet determination, the same way of noticing a problem and wanting to fix it, rather than just accept it. On the anniversary of his death this year, Linda came to stay with us for the week. We drove out to the cemetery together, the three of us, Emma between us, holding both our hands. The grass had grown in fully around his headstone by then, and someone from his old unit had left a small stone on top of it, a tradition among Marines, a way of saying someone had visited, someone remembered. Linda knelt down and traced his name with her fingers, the same way she used to trace his name in his baby book, she told me once, back when it was the only version of his handwriting she had. I stood there with my daughter's hand in mine, the fall air cool against my face, and I thought about that letter still sitting safely at home, his voice preserved in ink, telling me things he never got the chance to say out loud. I thought about how close I'd come to letting Linda's words define what people remembered about our marriage, about how easily grief can twist itself into blame if you let it sit too long without the truth to push back against it. Emma let go of my hand and knelt down next to her grandmother, and together they placed a small bundle of flowers against the headstone. Linda said something quiet to the grave, words I couldn't quite hear, and didn't try to, some private thing between a mother and the son she'd misjudged in her grief, and later come to understand again through his own words. I stood back a few steps and let them have that moment together, watching the wind move through the grass around the rows of white headstones stretching out in every direction, each one holding its own story, its own family standing somewhere trying to make sense of a loss too large to fully hold. And for the first time since that rainy Tuesday morning, when two Marines stood on my porch, I felt something close to peace settle over me. Not because the grief was gone, but because the truth had finally found its way home. The same way Michael always had, every single time, no matter how far the road took him.